Hello, everyone. Welcome to easily and by far the most financially important panel in the whole of the festival, because this is how all of the other great ideas and proposals and things that must happen that everyone else is talking about get actually paid for. Without the money, what are our movements asking for? What are our campaigning? What is it focused on? And the key thing is that in 2021, we have a lot of opportunities to raise new additional money for fighting poverty, for achieving the SDGs, and for ending COVID with equity, and for succeeding on with all our climate ambitions. So our dear friend Homi Kharas from Brookings, who's on the line here and in the call, came up with a number. He estimates approximately $1 trillion a year in additional financing is needed for the next 10 years to be in the ballpark of what is necessary to achieve the SDGs. And through the various different things that our experts are going to talk about, we're going to talk about how to raise that extra $1 trillion a year. They're going to talk about ODA, Harpinder Collacott will talk about ODA, aid. David McNair from One about debt and liquidity. Homi talking about the multilateral development banks and these very sexy things called special drawing rights. We're looking forward to that, Homi. Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi will talk about taxes, what experts call domestic revenue mobilization, domestic resource mobilization, and also how to make sure money is better spent, public financial management. Mike Hugman will talk about SDG Linked Bonds, and he will explain what they are, as will Maya Mehta about social bonds, and Anita Bhatia from UN Women, rounding us off vitally, she'll be joining later, about gender disaggregated finance and gender linked bonds. We're going to look at the contribution of each of these towards raising that $1 trillion. But just kind of one thing further before we go into hearing from our panelists. COVID has been a massive call upon the world's resources. It has also brought into stark reminder the extreme inequalities we all face. But something I fear many of us have forgotten is quite how unequal our world is. And to put that in crude, brutal financial terms, a few years ago, it was estimated that per person per year in the very poorest countries, the world had about $115 per person to spend to achieve the SDGs, $115, of which $8 per person per year was for health. Something like $26 or $23 was for education, and so on, and maybe about $13, $14 was for social safety nets per person per year. At the bare minimum, we need about $350 per person per year in the very poorest countries, and it increases from there the wealthier the economies that people live in. We are far off what we needed even then to achieve the SDGs, and COVID has set us further back. So we need the creativity of everyone in this panel, both on the specific things they're going to talk about, but also how these can roll into more than the sum of their parts. If we're going to get a new eco-social contract delivered for people and planet, and for the achievement of the SDGs, and for ending COVID with equity, we're going to have to find that $1 trillion from the things that our panelists are going to talk about. So first of all, let's hear from Harpinder about ODA. What is it? Why is it important? Where can we get some more of it?
Thank you so much, Jamie. Can I start off with making a point that financing is simply not just about increasing the total amount of dollars. I completely get the importance of actually having a number in there. But I really want to make the point that it's also about raising the right type of finance for the right initiative as well. So both public and private finance are important to the success of the SDGs, but one cannot supplement the other. They have very unique roles to play, and that's why a mix of the right financial mechanisms are so essential. And that's why I think this panel is great, because it's looking at all of those components and not honing in on one side as well. But you've asked me to talk about official development assistance, ODA, or aid as it's often called. And this is a main international public finance flow. And it's specifically, I think, very unique because it targets poverty and support to some of the poorest people and poorest countries in the world. Now, ODA has been the backbone of social change in many countries, supplementing low levels of domestic public finance in many countries to support education, health, and social change services. Many countries, Jamie, just as you mentioned, domestic public resources are just too small due to a very low tax base to meet the basic needs of people. And that's where ODA comes in. So let me give you just an example on that. We've estimated that governments need to spend around $79 per person per year to provide basic coverage in essential health services. However, in 2019, 22 low-income country governments were spending just $10 per person per annum on healthcare, just $10. And then you bring ODA into that. An average of ODA contributions in that same year was a further $11 per person per annum on healthcare budgets in the low-income countries. So we have a supplementing role going on with ODA there, where it's supplementing domestic expenditure on health with the international flow that it brings in. But it's still far from sufficient to meet the needs of the millions of people whose basic healthcare services are just missing, I'm afraid, as a result of this. So although ODA is playing an important role, it explicitly targets poverty, it can build human capital, it can respond to the needs of people impacted by a crisis, and can be invested in resilience mechanisms to strengthen communities from shocks. It isn't substantial enough at the moment to actually meet the needs of the global community, particularly following this crisis. One of the figures I wanted to share with you, with our audience today, is that ODA has been specifically very important to certain types of countries, and it has increasingly targeted some of those places where the need is the greatest. So in 2018, ODA represented 26% of total external finance flows to least developed countries and 17% to fragile states. So it has been playing an important role, but unfortunately, some of our analysis more recently, particularly from the International Aid Transparency Initiative, which is our source for the latest data, is showing that ODA commitments are actually they're not being sustained by governments at the levels that we need to be sustained. And our concern now is that ODA commitments from governments to developing countries in particular are falling. Our analysis shows a fall by a quarter last year. So that's commitments of ODA going to developing countries. While ODA dispersed by international finance institutes did actually increase yet last year, but this will be very, very hard to sustain without replenishment from governments. And one point I'd make about ODA that is delivered through IFIs, the international financing institutions, is that it comes in the form of loans. So 96% of all ODA delivered through IFIs in 2020 was in the form of loans, not grants and cash transfers, which is what is often needed in a crisis like we've got at the moment.
So great, thank you, Pin. I think we have to keep moving along. Sorry, is there one final last thought there?
Now, I was going to add a little bit extra with regards to what our audience can do to really keep the pressure on, because I think it's really important that governments know the value that ODA can particularly play in this current crisis. And it's great to have our audience really focus on the pressure that they should be putting on sustaining and increasing ODA rather than actually seeing cuts in it. Thank you. Absolutely.
Specifically, many of us in the United Kingdom, let's be focused here, are fighting a proposed cut by the government from 0.7% of GNI to 0.5. That must not be allowed to happen. It will about to be illegal. We're going to make sure that the Parliament, Conservatives in the government, do not let that cuts be made into law, because we actually have in the UK a law that 0.7% of the country's income must go on international aid. We're going to keep it that way. Watch this space, and if you're in the UK, join that campaign. So David, over to you. Debt cancellation. Pin talked a bit about aid turning into loans. Take us away on debt, especially in the context of this crisis.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah. So debt in itself is not a bad thing. In our personal lives, we borrow money to purchase a home, to pay for our education, to invest for the future. And for governments, debt allows them to invest in roads, in digital connectivity, airports, the kinds of things that will spur investment, create jobs, and in turn help people lift themselves out of poverty. In a sense, debt buys you time, a bit like a delayed tax, but it usually needs to be paid back with interest, and the investments need to make a return. and those repayments need to be manageable. And that means three things. First of all, the cost of repayments has to be affordable. Second, how you spend it matters, both in terms of what you spend it on and the quality of that spending. And third, lenders need to be flexible during the biggest crisis in a generation, which is what we're in right now. We know that COVID has hit many countries hard. Tourism, migrant remittances, other forms of income have declined dramatically. At one point last year, 99% of Nigerian federal government revenues were spent on debt service, 99%. And this year, the country has cut its health and education budget, in part to keep up with its debt service repayments. So what needs to happen? First, we need debt service suspension during the crisis. That doesn't mean the debt payment is cancelled. It just means that the payments are rescheduled to free up cash to help countries respond to the pandemic. Some governments have played their part. Private lenders and institutions like the World Bank have not. And in fact, last year, about 80% of debt owed by the poorest countries was not suspended. So there's a partial solution, but it needs to go much further. Second, we need a much more comprehensive approach to those countries that can no longer manage their debts. And that must include all lenders, including the private sector. And some countries have requested restructuring of their loans. That has then hit their credit rating, meaning that their monthly repayments have actually gone up. So we need a much better solution to managing this effectively. And finally, we need to make sure that low and middle income countries can borrow cheaply and aren't paying a risk premium because they have smaller economies or they're perceived to be a greater risk for lenders. And there are technical ways of doing that if rich countries' central banks got involved and helped out. And finally, as Homi is going to talk about later, we also need a major economic stimulus package to help countries weather the crisis and build back better. Debt is not a bad thing, but it needs to be managed effectively. And during a crisis, lenders need to be flexible. So what you can do about it, you can push your government to support debt suspension and debt restructuring. You can push for this stimulus package because ultimately this will help us achieve the SDGs much faster, much more effectively, and respond to the pandemic, which is in all of our interests.
Thank you, David. Great. Homi, so over to you. The role of the IMF and the World Bank has been mentioned a number of times already. What more should they be doing right now?
Thank you, Jamie. So, look, I think that everybody knows that this crisis has been a crisis of historic proportions. And I'd just like to remind people of the dimensions of the crisis. So, there are countries like Belize and the Maldives. These countries have lost more than 1/5 of their total output in 2020 because they were so heavily dependent on tourism, and tourism, of course, crashed. But in almost every developing country, there have been real reductions in spending on education, in spending on roads, in public investments that have accompanied the recessions in these countries. And that can only be offset if governments are able to borrow money and have the funds to be able to reverse those declines. And that's why we came up with this number of something around an additional $1 trillion a year. And of that trillion, I would say that at least 150 billion, we'd be talking about needing to go towards low-income countries, and another 550 to 600 billion that we should be going to lower middle-income countries, and the rest are countries that are relatively well off. So if we need that volume of money, where can it come from? A lot of people say, well, it can come from private capital markets because that's where actually the big bucks are. And there's a certain truth to that. Capital markets do have a big volume of money. But for most developing countries, as David mentioned, that money is quite expensive. And we need the money to be cheaper. And that's where the IMF and the multilateral development banks come in. So there's been a lot of discussion just now about the IMF creating new liquidity instruments. They're called special drawing rights. But basically, the IMF can almost create money that it can allocate to countries. We're talking about something like $650 billion equivalent. But when the IMF does that, it allocates the money to countries more or less in proportion to their economic heft. And that means most of the money doesn't go to the countries, the developing countries, which have had the greatest economic shocks. It goes to the countries in the world that are the largest and most systemically important. So in addition, we need some mechanism for reallocating those SDRs towards the countries with greater need. We also have to understand that SDRs are simply a one-off issuance. They can be really useful for the immediate crisis for the next year or two, but they're not going to be financing the 10-year increase in investment levels that we think is required. And that's where the multilateral development banks come in. The multilateral development banks basically go to private capital markets, borrow there, use their leverage and their financial strength to borrow very cheaply, and then they can pass on those savings to individual developing countries. If the multilateral development banks had a little bit more capital, a little bit more ambitious and creative use of the capital that they already have, they could certainly increase their annual lending levels by at least $250 billion a year. So a very sizable chunk of the increment that we need. But I think in order to do that, they have to be very sure that that money is actually going towards things that will generate the resources, the financial resources that will allow countries to then repay the money when it comes due in 10 years or 15 years, which is a typical term of a multilateral development bank loan. And so there has to be a much closer connection between the multilateral development bank financing and the country's own SDG plans and their own commitments under the Paris Accord. Why aren't the MDBs doing this already now? It's because their shareholders are concerned. They're concerned about the MDBs taking on more risk. They're concerned that the various safeguards that the MDBs have already imposed should not be weakened. But I would argue that in this time of extreme crisis, developing countries need far more flexibility to use their money as they see fit, rather than according to very stringent and uniform guidelines that might be established elsewhere. Because without that, they can't respond to the crisis in the way that they deem fit. So I think the multilateral development banks will have a very large role to play as we move forward. And they're the only source of finance that is suitable for this kind of long-term development investments. The private capital, as we've just seen in the crisis, is a little bit too pro-cyclical and a little bit too expensive to be that useful in many places for development investments. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Homi. And I think it's extremely important that all the campaigners and the community of SDG advocates on these calls take away a clear, precise action. We have the spring meetings coming up. We'll talk about this a bit more at the end, of the IMF and the World Bank and the G7 and G20 finance ministers meeting. And very clearly, we want this SDR issue and to explore next steps on a SDR reallocation mechanism and force the World Bank into being, should we say, less conservative about its balance sheets to deliver much more of these resources quickly. But it must align and get behind well-governed, country-owned plans. And Mavis, if you could take it away from there on at the country level, what countries are doing to increase the quality and quantity of domestic resources, of taxes, and make sure that money is well spent.
Thank you very much, Jamie. As we all know, governments get the money that they use to spend on health service, education, etc., from the taxes that they collect. And the more money they collect, the more they can spend. In 2018, domestic revenue represented only 19% of Africa's GDP. That is $443 billion. This $443 billion is 7.5% lower than what the rest of the world collected. As a result of COVID, we have lost a lot of this money, and we are estimating that we've lost roughly 179 billion of the money on the continent. But it's not just how much we collect that matters, but also how well we spend it. And that's why public finance management matters. Public finance management in Africa continues to improve. And in 2019, of the 20 countries that showed the greatest improvement in public finance management, according to the World Bank, 7 of them were in Africa. Africa has a young population and needs to ensure that this population is educated and is skilled for the future. And this requires that governments have the money to finance education. Currently, African governments spend about 5% of GDP on education, which is the second highest of any region. Whilst African countries are devoting significant resources to education, the region has the worst performance when it comes to efficiency of spending of that money. According to the African Development Bank, Africa has a 58% efficiency score for primary education and 41% for secondary education. Both of these scores are 20% points lower than the second worst performing region. Now, if public finance spending was more efficient in education in Africa and it was on par with Latin America, the region's primary school completion rate would rise from 79% to 98%. So how do we make improvements? First, we need to increase tax levels, and as a result, increase the amount of domestic resources governments have to spend. There are a number of ways we can do this. First, we need to improve budget transparency. We need to strengthen the capacity and tools available for revenue authorities to collect taxes. We need to fight illicit flows and corruption, and we need to ensure that we can reach global agreements on the taxation of multinational corporations and the rapidly growing digital economy so that they are paying a fairer share of taxes. Second, as I said before, a robust and transparent public finance management is key to building confidence of donors and our own taxpayers. This confidence is likely to secure the increased revenue we need from our taxpayers and from citizens and businesses to pay their taxes, and also the confidence we need from international community to contribute more overseas development assistance, as well as from the multinational corporations. So going forward, what can we do? There are opportunities for us to really rebound and build back better. The first one is transparent budgeting. As part of the investments that countries have done on COVID-19 recovery, we can really be transparent in how that money has been spent and build citizen confidence. So for example, sharing how the limited budget countries have had has been used to provide much needed social protection and support for small and medium enterprises that have been very fragile during this period. Secondly, governments can use the opportunity in building back better to streamline their budgets, focus on what is important, remove duplications across line ministries. Thirdly, they can map out how they will mainstream adaptation and mitigation plans in core policy areas to ensure that their countries are rebuilding economies that are resilient and can withstand future climate and health shocks. And finally, governments should identify and invest in growth areas that can contribute to domestic resource revenue mobilizations, and also areas that can really help them achieve their sustainable development objectives. I think by doing this, as David and Homi have rightly pointed out, the money doesn't come just from domestic resources. It comes from a wide range of sources. But if governments can increase their domestic resources, if governments can find efficiency savings in how they spend money at the moment, I think up to 70% of that 1 trillion funding could be found for SDG financing. And of course, they will have to borrow some of it, some will be domestic resources, but they can really drive that agenda. So let me use a very quick example, Jamie. The World Bank estimates that we need roughly 7 billion a year to achieve the SDG on nutrition. Currently, they are estimating that with increased resources and efficiencies, low-income countries can contribute 50% of this money themselves, and low middle-income countries can contribute 70%. So my call to all our SDG activists out there, ask your countries to be transparent on their budgets and get companies to pay a fairer share of their taxes. Thank you.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, Mavis. And so Mike, to SDG linked bonds, and I think picking on what Mavis just said, presumably also the private sector would invest more where governance improves as well, driven by citizens' demand for that improvement. But explain what an SDG linked bond is when you're at home, please.
I will do, Jamie. Well, I'm very lucky because I can build on the fantastic contributions that already gone before. So an SDG linked bond is in essence a pretty simple idea, which is that you take a normal bond. A bond is a way that countries and most companies borrow money, so paying back a fixed interest rate, and you link that bond to some agreed performance indicators, some KPIs. And in linking the bond to the KPIs, what you can do is then provide incentives or structure that bond in a way that can benefit the country borrowing the money if it's able to deliver on the KPIs that have been agreed. So you can have a situation where a country, based on its own national strategies, and in very much, Jamie, in line with the introduction that you made, using the aims, the priorities of those countries, of their governments, of civil society, have that bond structured in such a way that if the country is able to raise the level of its public financial management in precisely the way that Mavis has just explained in wonderful clarity, then you can have donors or other organizations, cash flows coming from initiatives like carbon markets, nature-based solutions that generate revenue, reducing the interest cost to the country that's borrowed the money. And the reason this is critical, it links back exactly to what David and Homi were talking about before, is the current financial markets that we have that have developed over the last 20 years to enable borrowing by low, middle income and low income countries are just not fit for purpose. They look far too often a little bit more akin to loan sharks than to government bond markets. The interest rates are too high. And just at the moment when countries need to borrow, as they did last year during a crisis, what happens is those bond markets shut and private investors lend all of their money to Germany or to the US. By improving the quality of spend that comes from that borrowing, linking those bonds to these performance indicators, to these SDG performance indicators, providing those reduced interest rates where governments are delivering on their own spending priorities, we can both lower the cost of debt, but I think also over time, there is evidence that you will make those bond markets more stable, more readily accessible for countries when they need them. This sounds very fancy, but actually these kind of bonds are already being issued by a lot of companies in developed economies, and it's really a big growth area in investment at the moment. And this same idea can be used to create partnerships for better spending outcomes, lower interest rates, and greater debt sustainability across low and middle income countries. The scale of those bond markets, just to finish quickly, Jamie, is enormous, and I think can provide much of the other 30% of that trillion that Mavis has talked about. And the moments are coming now to start to push our governments, private market players to start to think about lending money in this more responsible way, creating these linkages to these key performance indicators to really push us towards the SDGs, rather than having financing working separately from the goals that everyone on this at this festival wants to achieve. Thanks.
Fantastic. I mean, this sounds like this isn't your grandfather's capitalism. This is putting manners and morality on money to make it point in the directions that citizens within countries want. And in some ways, it helps citizens have another tool to hold their governments accountable. And that's the jujitsu. That's the kind of the fascinating thing about what you said. And also what Maya is going to explain about social bonds, which very much builds on what you've been saying. Maya, over to you.
Thank you, Jamie. Yes, social bonds are a great way to help fill the SDG financing gap at scale. What they give us is access to a vast new pool of capital, ESG investors, environmentally, socially, and governance-driven investors, such as pension funds, who are increasingly under consumer pressure to put socially responsible investments in their portfolio and exclude controversial, harmful activities. And 2020 was a turning point in more ways than one. We saw unprecedented social bond issuance in the market as a result of the pandemic. We saw billions going into addressing really urgent social needs, such as healthcare and unemployment and community well-being. One notable example was the $3 billion bond raised by the African Development Bank, which went to help improve sanitation and sustainable water supplies and construct hospitals, and all of which was going to lead to job creation. And it wasn't just the big governments and the development banks, corporates also got involved. Another interesting example last year, addressing another pressing social issue, was the $5.75 billion record-breaking corporate sustainable bond issued by Alphabet, Google's parent. And that was to help address racial inclusion. It actually cited racial equity as one of its commitments, and it would use part of its proceeds to fund Black businesses and education. It was called a sustainable bond because it mixed green and social projects. And thereby it addressed one of the key challenges of social bonds. How do you actually generate revenue from social projects? That's why we often see green and social mixed together as one package. Another challenge of social bonds is social impact measurement. It's easier in the green world.
You mean avoiding greenwashing and avoiding social washing, avoiding SDG washing?
Avoiding all sorts of washing. We have to develop consistent methods of being able to collate data and report data to investors. It's much easier in the scientific green world where you've got greenhouse gas emissions. It's also a nuanced process to calculate that, but it's easier than measuring the impact on improvement and livelihoods, for example. Just as with revenue generation, we see in the green world, it's easier for them because you've got tangible business assets rather than in the social impact world. Another challenge for social bonds is cost. There's obviously a financial cost, as with any bond, to take a bond to market, because you have to hire a whole suite of professional advisors. But there's also a potential legal and reputational cost. If you don't get that disclosure right, as we were saying, Jamie, if you don't comply with the bond prospectus regulations and now a new wave of sustainable finance legislation coming globally, but in particular from the EU, then you have an issue. What you don't want is to be accused of social washing or mis-selling. But there are things that we can do in the market to help with this. As I say, we can develop tools that investors can use to measure that social data. And actually one important tool, one important framework is the ICMA social bond principles. That's the International Capital Markets Association. In 2017, they decided we need to just really enhance transparency and credibility in this market. And they developed principles focusing on the use of proceeds and reporting and management of proceeds and also selection of projects. And they have a whole range of social criteria. So for example, projects can include food security, affordable housing, and they must benefit target populations, so the marginalized, gender minorities, people with disabilities. So you can see all of this is very much aligned with the SDGs. So I think this is going to be an interesting year, 2021. We're all gearing up towards COP26, the climate summit, and it's not just about climate. Thanks to helpful concepts such as just transition, which says that we, when transitioning to a low carbon economy, must leave no person behind. Thanks to discussions around an inclusive COP, hopefully we can keep the spotlight on social bonds.
Fantastic.
And hopefully with creative structuring and consistent tools and community pressure, we can also make sure that it's an inclusive tool for everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maya. And we're not just gearing up, though, for COP26. We're also gearing up for the Generation Equality Forum. Are we not, Anita?
Thank you very much, Jamie. And I am following in the footsteps of some fabulous speakers who've already talked about what's happening in the market for ESG bonds. And so I want to talk about gender-linked bonds. But first, I want to say that why this is so important this year is because, although this has been said very many times, it is worth repeating that women actually have really suffered because of the pandemic. They've suffered principally in three areas: income, health, and security. And we at UN Women have been following the policy measures that most governments have undertaken as part of very large fiscal and economic stimulus packages to understand whether or not these impacts have been factored into the policy responses. So one factor that I want to share right up front is, of all of the countries that we analyzed in the UN Women UNDP Global Gender Policy Tracker, and it's on our website, go look for it, please. Of the countries we analyzed, only 12%, just 25 countries actually have holistic responses that cover violence against women, social protection measures, as well as measures to ensure that women are going back into the labor market. Now I want to talk about gender bonds because this is something that actually doesn't exist for sovereigns. There are plenty, well, perhaps not plenty, but there are some private banks that have issued gender bonds, and there are corporates who have issued gender bonds. But in fact, sovereigns have not yet issued gender bonds, principally because a number of things are lacking. And those things that are lacking have to do with both what are the standards for a gender bond, what constitutes a gender bond? Is it a social bond with, a sentence on gender, or is there something really gender specific about it? And what we can say is that we see this as a very powerful accountability mechanism because, as we have discussed previously, spend on gender by ministries generally is highly variable, and most governments do not have gender markers which actually show you where the spend is going to be. So this is fundamentally an issue of public budgeting, and this is why gender responsive budgeting is really important, but it's not enough. What is really needed is both being able to track what the spend is, but then to be able to verify that the use of proceeds and the projects that are picked for which the money will be used actually have a gender impact. And that's where an institution like UN Women and others come in, because we can help on that stamp of approval and saying, yes, this actually is going to have an impact on gender. There's some numbers up here I want to share with you, that the size of the overall green social sustainability bond market was last year, year before, about 300 billion. Of that, 2 billion was aligned with gender. So we have a very long way to go. We know there are lots of institutional investors who are interested in this. We've been talking to one government in particular, and there were investors who were willing to do a private placement. So we know that the appetite is out there. What we don't have is the fully developed framework yet, which has both the principles, definitions, through the gender markers of which projects would qualify, and that's what we're working on. There is both the issue of supply and demand. We're excited about the fact that with the upcoming Generation Equality Forum, there are a few countries who already have borrowing plans for this year, who are willing to consider thinking about a gender bond and actually converting one of the regular issuances that they were going to do into a gender bond. One final word, Jamie. We've been talking, and I heard previous speakers talk about trade-offs. We have to put on the table the issue of expenditures on defense and what the implications are if governments continue to spend the way they do on defense. This was part of the Beijing platform and declaration of action. We need to come back to this issue because as GDPs shrink, as the pie shrinks, and as you have to make more trade-offs and decide what you're going to spend on, we're already seeing cutbacks on key issues that matter for women and girls. We've seen the figures from UNESCO and the World Bank that just came out on the drop in spending in education. Where's this money going to come from? Something has to give. The thing that can give is defense. Let's take money from spending on weapons and move it towards women and girls.
Yes, I think as President Biden said yesterday or the day before, if people talk about values, show me their budget and I'll tell you what their values are. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. And that case of gender bonds as a sort of a key tool to unlock more financing, but not letting go of the fact we also need more ODA, we need more domestic resource mobilization. We also need foundations to step up. We need to leverage remittances, something we haven't talked about yet so far. We also need to look at reforming fossil fuel subsidies, getting rid of those and redirecting those funds into healthcare and core SDG accounts. So there's lots of other things we haven't been able to talk about in this panel today. But I really want to thank you, Anita, Maya, Mike, Homi, Mavis, David, and Harpinder. It's been an incredibly important discussion. This is how we raise the at least $1 trillion a year we need for the next 10 years. Some think it might be a little more than $1 trillion a year additional. But these are the tools and mechanisms that exist. They're not pie in the sky, they're practical, they're available. They need a bit of a shove and a push. And that's where the viewers, the participants, the people who have viewed this panel and engaged, I hope, in its contents must come in. Because we can't actually advance the ideas that everyone's talked about without your campaigning and voice and engagement. You know, right now, people are putting pressure on the G7 finance ministers, the G20 finance ministers, the major shareholders of the IMF and the World Bank, key finance ministries in the global south and across Africa to improve the quantity and quality of spending to respond to COVID, to fund green climate recoveries, and to reset the system for the SDGs. And through the tools that the panel have gone through here, I think we have the things that are available. And on the and we have some key dates, which I hope the SDG Action Festival will share with everyone here. We've got a UK Climate Development Summit coming up in just a few days, in just under a week. We've got the G20 and G7 finance ministers and IMF World Bank meetings happening in the first half of April. Then Biden's Crucial Climate Summit. Then we go into Biodiversity, Health, Generation Equality Forum, and then the G7 hosted by the UK. So the first half of the year is jam-packed with opportunities to hear what the panel have just talked about and turn it into campaignable propositions that we take to the policymakers. And I've been part of campaigns which have successfully raised hundreds of billions of dollars for the MDGs and the SDGs in the past. And we need to up our game together because we've got to raise over $1 trillion additional a year. But the good news is with these tools and this creativity, I think we can. So with that, I just want to thank the panel. Thank you, everyone. This has been great. And look forward to working with you all to make sure all of this happens.